Welcome to episode 4 of the Talk Wildlife podcast. Today's topic is the art of feeding birds in your garden. Now, let's talk wildlife. First of all, on the topic of feeding birds, I'll just start off with something I noticed the other day at work, which was really interesting and may interest you as well. We have 2 missel thrush fledglings, and yesterday we noticed that one of the missel thrushes, the one who gapes more, is actually feeding the other one when it gapes, which explains why it's now not gaping as much. And at the last rescue I worked at, apparently before I started, there was actually a pigeon that once fed a starling, which is even more interesting because pigeons don't even feed their young through gaping. They do it by crop feeding. So the fact that a pigeon was able to feed a starling, which feeds in a completely different way to them, is, I think really cool. So back to the topic in hand. The art of feeding birds might seem like a strange topic for a podcast. After all, everyone can feed birds. You just put a feeder in your garden and some fat balls or peanuts and hang it up and walk away, don't you? Well, there's so much more to it than that, and there's certain ways that you can do it more effectively and more safely than you may already be doing. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing what to feed, what not to feed, different methods concerning how to feed, where to feed, how to feed safely, who you want to be feeding and who you might not want to be, when to feed, and various other important things to consider when feeding any animals in your garden. If you don't have a lot of choice, however, then do remember that you need nothing more than a window to feed your birds. You don't need a big garden, and you don't need lots of money to buy a bird feeder. So let's start off with something simple first of all. Safe foods, any limitations on the use of these foods, and then unsafe foods to put out. I won't list all the food that you can feed birds because it would just take hours and hours, but I'll just list the general types. Wild birdseed, first of all. If you buy it from a good supplier, you can get these from supermarkets or online, and they can be fed all year round in a wire feeder or on a bird table. Most fruits can be fed, such as halved grapes, chopped apple and pear, banana slices, banana chips, berries, and most cooked vegetables are okay too. Chilies can also be fed, which may be surprising, but unlike mammals, birds can tolerate spice because they don't actually get affected by spice. Whole grain bread you can feed in moderation. Soaked is easier digested than unsoaked and is a lot better than bleached and white bread. Nuts, pasta, cooked rice, and most other kitchen scraps are fine as well, although I'll mention them more in a minute. Waxworms and mealworms are also great too, but I'll just explain the limitations of some of the above, and foods which need to be moderated. So with wild bird seeds, you don't want to be feeding your birds only sunflower seeds or peanuts. These are both fine as part of a balance, but on their own they can result in calcium deficiency. And in fact, in mammals, who are commonly fed these 2 foods without enough variation, this can actually lead to metabolic bone disease, which is a really painful disease which can actually cause them to die. So it's important that while you can feed sunflower seeds and peanuts, don't just feed these, feed them as part of a varied diet. And when it comes to feeding nuts in general, nuts and peanuts, make sure these are always in a wire feeder or chopped up or crushed very small, as these can be choking hazards, especially if being fed to baby birds. And rice and popcorn should be fed unsalted because birds cannot digest salt and this can be very bad for them. Suet or fat balls are very good things to feed, although should not be fed in summer, as summer is a time when the birds need protein, as well as spring, whereas in the colder months they can have fat, as they'll need it to survive the winter. When feeding fruit, leave off the skins if the fruit has been treated with pesticides, and remove any seeds in apples as these actually contain cyanide. Avoid feeding any fruits with a pit still in them or stones, such as nectarines, peaches and cherries. If you want to feed these fruits, just remove the stones beforehand. Don't allow fresh fruit to become mouldy or serve already mouldy fruit or vegetables, and do not feed tomato leaves, although the tomatoes themselves are okay. With bread, avoid feeding lots of bread in the summer months, and do not feed too much, as this is only good in moderation. Avoid feeding dry roasted peanuts, and only buy from a reputable supplier, as they can contain a toxin which can kill birds. Unsafe foods, which you should definitely not feed birds, include anything that's unhealthy for us, such as crisps or high-salt fatty foods, caffeinated foods, alcohol-containing foods, chocolate, and other highly processed foods. Raw beans as well are not good to feed, which are also not good for us. Fungus, mushrooms, they shouldn't be fed, and avocado is one to definitely avoid, as it contains a fatty acid substance which can cause heart damage and even death in birds. Garlic and onion should be avoided too, although if you're feeding crushed up crackers which maybe contains 2% garlic granules or powder, then this wouldn't be something to worry about. Meat is sort of a personal choice. If you have meat scraps, just avoid any bones being fed to the birds. And on a hot summer's day, you may want to avoid this anyway, as it can turn rancid pretty quickly and may also attract certain animals which you don't want to be attracted to your bird table. A lot of birds which can eat meat won't need it anyway, as even corvids eat berries, nuts and seeds as well. And if you want to feed something more meaty, you can feed a cat or dog food, including soaked dog or cat biscuits, although make sure that these are always soaked all the way through with no hard bits in the middle, as these too can be a choking hazard. During a drought, soaked dog biscuits are actually a really good thing to feed, since they've got high water content. But make sure that you remove these after a few hours, as they can go bad very quickly on a hot summer's day. And again, think about what animals may be attracted due to the smell of this. Other things to avoid include milk, cooked oats, although they're okay in oat cakes, but cooked oats like a porridge can actually harden around a bird's beak. Desiccated coconut also has to be avoided, as it can swell in a bird's stomach and even kill them, but fresh in the shell is absolutely fine. Also, I'll mention this later, put out water if you can, as this is good all throughout the year. And if you have a fountain, then it means in winter you don't have to worry about the water freezing over. I'll now move on to good versus bad feeders and types of feeders in general. I'll just mention a couple of things which I think should be avoided when it comes to bird feeders, and then I'll list 5 different types of bird feeders which you can find out about on the Wildlife Trust website. Spiral feeders, which are usually designed for fat balls, I would say should be avoided, and that's because birds can actually get trapped in them, especially if they're completely empty. You can also get other fat ball feeders which are similar shape, but they have bars going down, I think 3 or 4 bars that go down the length of the feeder, and birds can actually get trapped in these as well. And it's especially important to not allow these to become rusty, because if a bird does become trapped in one, then it's more likely to cause injury if it's rusty. So always check on your feeders, and if they're empty or you have to go away for some reason and can't have anyone fill them up, then actually remove them rather than keep them there and have the risk of a bird getting stuck and no one checking on them.
Haven't you had a couple of occasions where you've actually had birds stuck in, especially the spiral feeders, brought into you at the wildlife rescue?
More than a couple. I've seen pictures of them stuck in the spiral feeders, but it was actually the ones which I'm struggling to describe. They're not spiral, but they're like the spiral ones, but with the wire that runs all the way down. They've sort of got circles maybe 1.5 inches apart from each other going up the feeder, but I've had maybe 3 or 4 birds that I've seen personally, starlings I think they all were, stuck in them, and it's because they were empty and because they hadn't been filled up. But if they're half empty, I'm sure there's still a risk. So either make sure they're always full or just remove them.
Yeah, I mean, just a bit of common sense, I guess. Do a bit of research and make sure the feeder that you're going to buy for your birds is safe. And do a little bit of research online, like I said.
Yeah, and just keep checking them frequently, because then if anything does get stuck, at least you can remove it or take it to a wildlife rescue centre. Even bird feeders and bird tables with cages around them can get animals stuck in them. I've seen pictures and stories of squirrels who managed to get into cages that was either meant to deter them or to deter larger animals, and there was a story of one which went in, ate loads of nuts and then couldn't get out again and had to be helped.
And I'll tell you what, trying to get a squirrel out of a bird feeder which is trapped,
I do not envy whoever has to do that.
They bite you at the best of times. Being stuck inside a cage, feeling a bit bloated, over agitated and scared that a human's coming towards him is just not a scenario that I'd like to be facing.
I would just cut through the bird feeder. I wouldn't even try and salvage it.
At the end of the day, if you're getting animals getting caught in your bird feeder, there's no point in salvaging it anyway, because if animals are getting stuck and are now endangered because of the feeder you're using, it's best just to do away with that feeder. And make sure if you do throw a feeder away, make sure you discard it in the best way possible, because you don't want that going off to landfill or somewhere else where that then is maybe going to catch another creature. So just be a little bit thoughtful, mindful of when disposing of any feeders you no longer want because they pose a risk to wildlife, that where they end up they may also pose a risk to wildlife.
Anything you throw away that's a loop, even like the top of a carton for example, just cut it so that nothing can get stuck in it, and I'd say the same for rounded bird feeders. So there's 5 ways of providing food according to the Wildlife Trust, so I'll just go through it quickly. So hanging seed feeders, these will attract, according to the Wildlife Trust, robins, tits, goldfinches, house sparrows, greenfinches and siskins. Niger seed feeders, which are similar but hold Niger seeds, will attract goldfinches, siskins and redpolls.
I wish. I've never even seen a redpoll.
No, nor have I.
It's like, wow, that sounds cool.
If you're lucky enough. Mesh peanut feeders, Again, these allow the peanuts to be taken out little bit by little bit, rather than whole nuts to be swallowed. Will attract sparrows, starlings, chaffinches, and tits. Homemade bird feeders, which can be half coconuts or a pine cone covered in fat or vegetable suet, can attract tits, greenfinches, and house sparrows. And ground and table feeding, which Kev will talk about later, can attract birds such as blackbirds, collar doves, thrushes, dunnocks, and robins.
So I just want to talk a bit about 2 different feeders that you can have. So let's say you're in lockdown, you're not allowed to go out, and you don't have a garden, and you really love birds. You can still feed the birds. There is so many different types of window feeders that you can have. All you need, and hopefully you got one of these, is a window. I remember one of our old flats only had 2 windows, so we're limited, but it still brought the birds to the
I think a pigeon
window.
once fell in our window. We were feeding them on the windowsill, and they were eating, and they just came in. The pigeon just fell into our living room, but we didn't mind. I think we actually had another pigeon in our living room anyway at the time, just living there.
Yeah, so I mean, as long as you've got a window, you've got a windowsill. That's always good for attracting pigeons or gulls or corvids. But the window feeders I want to talk about are these ones which stick on your window and you put some sort of seed in and it attracts the birds in. Now, my mum has one of these and she always laughs because she's expecting to get the small, cute little birds, but she gets big wood pigeons trying to get in, which is quite a feat. And she often gets the collar doves who just sit in it and eat the food while they're sitting in it. Now, these are really, really great feeders and really good ways to get close-up views of birds. But you need to understand, if birds are coming that close to your window, you don't want to be standing right the other side of the pane of glass, nose to window, staring at them. They're probably not going to come if you do that. These are quick and cheap to buy and set up, but they may not attract some of the more nervous species. So you be aware that you're probably just going to see starlings. You might get a few different species of tits coming, and you're probably definitely going to see sparrows. I think our neighbour has a window feeder on a door, and the sparrows raid it all day long, which is great to see because those sparrows are doing fantastic raising their family. Make sure though that when you put your feeder on, you're following the instructions and it's on securely. You don't want it falling from your window and hurting the bird inside or on the feeder or anyone or any creature down below. One of the key things again with all feeders is make sure you clean it regularly. It's so vital. And I think, Flo, you're going to cover some bits about cleaning your feeders and why you should clean your feeder soon. But yeah, that's the window feeder. I mean, what do you think about those, Flo?
With the window feeders, obviously, because they're on windows, there's certain safety things you need to think about. So if you're not using the feeder, and by that I mean not watching them, you should keep your curtains on that window closed, which might not always be the most fun thing to do if you want light in your house, but there can be a risk of birds flying into the windows, especially if it's in a conservatory or the window is opposite another window, so the bird could see all the way through to the other side of the house, as they're likely to fly into it thinking they can get all the way through. Another thing you can do is put dots on your window. I think there's some companies which sell these special stickers of dots that you put on your window. And
the silhouettes. They do bird ones.
No,
as well.
there's just circles. I saw it on some TV program. Apparently that was meant to help.
You can, I believe, get window feeders which have certain things on them, which gives the bird the definition of the space in front of them, so they know there's something behind it they're not just going to continue straight through into.
If, however, the feeder seems to attract birds which frequently fly into the window, you might need to think about moving the bird feeder somewhere else. It might be because there's another window opposite it, or if you're in a conservatory, so the bird thinks it can fly all the way through. Also, if it keeps happening and for whatever reason you can't move the feeder, then you might just have to keep your curtains closed while it's used, which obviously takes away the enjoyment of you watching it, but it sort of depends. If you just want your birds to be fed and know they're being fed, then you can just keep your curtains closed to stop them flying through the window. Or if you've got any sort of little cameras you can set up, like some people do with bird boxes, you can watch them that way.
One of the things my mum does, she has her curtains almost quarter drawn, and it just gives that definition of there's something behind the window, so it stops the birds flying into them. I don't think my mum's had a window strike with her bird feeder yet, apart from the wood pigeons trying to squeeze their way into it, which they're striking on purpose because they're just trying to squeeze themselves through, which doesn't count. That's not the kind of window strike I'm meaning. The next one I want to talk about is ground bird feeders. You can feed birds Without feeders at all, you can feed them on the ground. Now you can have a little platform they feed from, like a feed tray, or you can just feed them on the grass. Now this is such a cheap and easy way to feed the birds. Ground feeding is really good for certain species like thrushes and blackbirds and dunnocks, wood pigeons, collar doves, even robins, because not all species are confident being up in the air on a swinging feeder. Some naturally feed on the ground, so you need to take those into consideration too. So if there's a certain type of species you want to attract to the garden, have a think about how they would feed naturally. Do they feed up in the trees and bushes, or do they feed on the grass, in the ground, in leaf litter? Because that then will determine the way that you will want to set up your feeder. With ground feeders, one key thing to be aware of is if you're going to feed the birds on the ground, make sure they're in the middle and in the open. Now the reason for this is if there's a prowling cat hidden in the bush, you don't want to be able to pounce out and catch one of the birds. It will just make easy pickings for cats and foxes and other predators who want to get them. So given the birds are always going to be on alert when they're on the ground anyway, give them that time so there's a good space between different areas that predators could hide is very, very key in this. And plus they'll feel more comfortable if they can see right around them and they're in the open, knowing that there's no cats about to pounce on them. But also with ground feeders, you need to be aware if you're putting food on the ground, especially if you're just putting it straight on the grass or on a patio slab or something like that, is if you can't pick that food up again and the birds don't eat it all within the day, you're then going to potentially attract unwanted visitors, maybe like mice or rats, cats maybe foxes. You know, if the food's sitting on the ground and you can't pick it up, something else may come and feed from that too. So you won't just be feeding the birds, you'll be feeding other wildlife. So this is where maybe having a feed tray is good, because at the end of the feed session, you scoop up the tray and that's pretty much all the food gone, leaving no waste behind.
Feeder hygiene is so important when it comes to the health of the birds that you're feeding. And that's because feeders are a breeding ground for disease. If you think of all the different birds of all the different species that come to your feeders, and some of them may be carrying something which will then be passed on to the other birds who come to the feeder later.
It just takes one bird that's got trichomoniasis to come to the feeder and use that feeder, and then just think if you've got a really popular bird feeder, think how that's going to spread through the population.
Yeah, things like trichomoniasis, which is a horrible disease of the throat and the digestive tract, are passed really easily just by a bird picking up a seed and then dropping it, or a bird pecking at a part of a feeder that another bird may then come and peck. So the best way to prevent the spread of diseases is to wash your bird feeder frequently. It's recommended that you do it weekly with hot soap and water and some sort of animal safe disinfectant. You can even do it with bleach, so 1 capful bleach to a whole bucket of water and then the feeder rinsed really thoroughly. It's really important that it isn't just done with water because you want to be killing whatever diseases are on there. If you can't do it once a week, then just do it as often as you can, but preferably weekly. But make sure that the washing of the bird feeders doesn't lead to rust problems, and make sure that you're also cleaning bird tables as well. So it's better if a bird table is a treated wood so that it's easier to clean and more hygienic. Another aspect of feeder safety is preventing over-reliance. And this means if you're going on holiday or if you're moving away from your house to somewhere else, you should phase out the feeding over a number of weeks so that birds aren't relying too heavily on it. Or if you're just going away on holiday for a week, see if a neighbour can make sure that the feeders are topped up, or feed them every day depending on how it is that you feed your birds. Providing natural ways of birds to feed is also helpful to prevent over-reliance on the feeders themselves. And that just means making sure that your garden is a haven for nature. And that can be just doing things that we talked about in our last podcast, allowing logs to sit in a corner, overgrown parts of your garden, stones, and anything that attracts insects.
To be honest, if you followed all the tips in the last podcast, you probably wouldn't even need a bird feeder.
So talking about what birds you might attract to your feeders, do you want to talk about, Kevin, what feeders might attract bird and mammal?
Yeah, certainly. So people will probably set out with the intention to just attract birds. I'm going to put a bird feeder up. I like to see the small, quiet, nice singing, colourful, little fluffy
friendly
birds.
birds.
The friendly birds, yeah.
Which actually aren't that friendly, because sparrows can be quite vicious.
Yeah.
As we too well know.
Well, I always say, when I've been bitten by many different species, and it's kind of a weird thing that I've got going on just now, working in wildlife rescue and that is how many different species end up biting me. And I think the worst bite I've ever had, I've been bitten by an osprey, so just in comparison, is a house sparrow. Their beaks are just, oh, they fill me with fear how much they hurt.
It's because they're small, they can get into the really small bits of skin between your fingers and just nip you.
They got really powerful little stunty beaks. So what can you expect to come to your feeder? Well, I guess this is always going to depend where you are geographically first and what is around your home. If you're in the middle of a town or city, most likely going to get gulls or pigeons or maybe the odd corvid come by. But if you're out and live near a forest, you could have a whole array of different species coming. But I mean, things like window feeders, you're going to get smaller birds like maybe the sparrows and different tits and finches and things like Flo mentioned before.
And wood pigeons.
Yeah, if you're my mum, you probably get wood pigeons, especially on your window feeders, which is crazy, considering they're bigger than her window feeder. And on the ground feeders, like I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to get thrushes and pigeons, like the ferals and the wood pigeons, blackbirds, and just other ground feeding birds. There are other birds that you may not want or expect to turn up that will, because if you're putting free food out there, what bird's going to turn down a free meal? If you feed the birds, don't try and feed it with the intention that you just want those cute, small, fluffy, nice birds coming along. You know, and don't complain if you get other birds that you don't expect. Enjoy them. You know, if you like the blue tits and you're getting them, great, enjoy them. But then if you're getting feral pigeons and like crows or jackdaws, which will come to your feeders because there's an opportunity to get free food, why wouldn't they take the opportunity? Don't be angry at them. Don't be annoyed by them. Yes, they may scare off the smaller birds, but they're not going to be there all the time. They'll take their fill and then they go. And the other birds will come back and they will feed. And they'll learn to feed at different times, I guess. But jackdaws and crows and all these other birds that come to your feeders, they're amazing birds too. They've all got their own little traits and personalities. So, in fact, it's even better when you get bigger birds because it's easier to observe their behaviours and get to know the individuals if they keep coming back. And you know the thing I love about it, Flo, it's a lottery. You do not know what's going to turn up on your feeder on each day. You go there and it's a surprise. I just think it's fantastic. If you're getting lots of birds coming to your feeder and it's really successful, do be aware this is going to attract predators. And one bird in particular, which is just the most fantastic, gorgeous bird, who has Freddy Krueger style talons, and I've not felt them yet, not been caught by this bird yet, or bitten by this bird, is the sparrowhawk. These are phenomenal hunters. They come at such speed. Before you know it, there's a flash of grey, an explosion of feathers.
And the linnet you've been watching is no more.
Yes, I was bird watching in Flo's sister's garden, and I was watching these linnets fly over, and I was really happy. I've not seen a linnet for years. Suddenly the linnet diverted its path really rapidly to the left, flew down, and a sparrowhawk comes straight over my head, caught it, pinned it, killed it, flew off of it, just like that. It was really sad seeing such a beautiful bird like a linnet get predated like that, but I was also in awe of just how efficient that sparrowhawk was. So do be aware, if you're feeding birds and lots of birds are coming, it will attract sparrowhawks. And sparrowhawks will go for pigeons, they'll go for starlings, they'll go for the smaller birds. And, you know, it's a part of nature. If you're bringing nature closer to you, you need to accept that birds like sparrowhawks or pigeons or corvids will come too. Don't feel bad by it. Enjoy them. Enjoy their presence. Enjoy being that close or having that species in your garden. I think it's just great. Again, it's the lottery of not knowing what's going to turn up.
There's a quotation that I really like by an ecologist at the University of Birmingham Centre for Ornithology. He's called Jim Reynolds. And he said, "Sparrowhawks and their breeding success, to my mind, are just as important as that of great tits and blue tits and everything else in people's gardens." And I take from that if your bird feeder helps sparrowhawks and their population, then you are still helping nature by feeding the birds in your garden.
Right, so another creature that could be attracted to all the birds at your bird feeder is a domestic cat. Now, a lot of people absolutely hate having cats scaring away their birds. But you're going to have to understand that having bird feeders and all these birds in the gardens will attract the cats. Cats kill millions of wild creatures every year. And with millions of cats in the UK, that's just a staggering number of wild birds and other creatures that they're killing. And Flo, I think you're going to cover this in a later podcast in the future, is that correct?
Yes, probably our most controversial podcast.
I think so too, and it's going to be controversial because there's so many people who love cats, so many people that own cats, and it's going to be very eye-opening. We're going to approach it, I believe, from a very neutral, scientific-based perspective, so you don't feel attacked, but you get to see the impact that your cat may be having on wildlife in your local area. If people are going to keep cats, then I think we all need to work together to find a way to protect nature, but allow cats to do what cats do. There are ways to deter cats from feeders, and I do that as a profession. So with my business, Humane Wildlife Solutions, one of the services I offer, and it's a very unique one, the only one in the UK as I understand, is a service to stop cats fouling in your garden and a service to stop cats coming and scaring the birds away from your feeders in the garden. So if you have that problem, get in touch with me at Humane Wildlife Solutions on any of our social media channels, and I can see if I can help you with that issue. Another visitor that you might get to your feeder is the good old squirrel. Be it red or grey, I think they're fantastic and they're so much fun to watch. Full of character, full of cheekiness, and they're super intelligent. I mean, Flo, how many videos you seen yourself of squirrels overcoming obstacle courses to get to a feeder?
They're so clever. Many, many videos.
I mean, Google it. Google squirrel bird feeder obstacle course and you'll find some hilarious videos. In fact, one of the videos I saw was of a squirrel, it was in Australia, I think it was, trying to get up a bird feeder and they put a slinky on it. So the squirrel will climb up the slinky and it gets halfway to the top and he'll just go down again. And it kept going up and down. And it was really funny to watch. Now, squirrels do live in urban areas and rural areas, and they enjoy the same foods as the birds will. And they're very intelligent, so they'll make use of these bird feeders. So you might need to accept that they're coming. And a lot of people do love their squirrels coming to their gardens. I love them. I love seeing squirrels. I love interacting with them. You can get feeders which claim to stop squirrels getting to the food, but I've seen many of these actually don't work. And then when you start introducing cages and protections around feeders, that's when you can start putting bird safety at risk as well. So it might just be worth allowing them to share the feeder as well. And at the end of the day, you benefit because you get to see another amazing creature. The next creature I'll talk about is one that pretty much all feeders will attract at one point or another. Rats and mice. A lot of people hate them, a lot of people love them. And I think they're fantastic creatures. Both have their own personal traits, which I absolutely love to see. So both will visit feeders if the food is not tidied up afterwards. So if the birds are making a big mess on the ground, be it from a ground feeder, a window feeder, or even from a hanging feeder where the seeds are falling to the floor, if they're not picked up at the end of the day, rats and mice will find them, and rats and mice will visit regularly. So if you don't want rats and mice coming, you're going to need to make sure you clean up after the birds every day. It's very important if you don't want them there, because once they're there, they can be tricky to move on. Though, if you do have trouble with rats in the gardens, once again, get in contact with me via my social media, and I'm more than happy to advise. We've had a spell this year, which we covered on one of the previous podcasts, where there was absolutely loads.
There's a way that you can deter rats, mice and squirrels, and that's simply just by putting chili powder on the food which the birds are having. Because as I said earlier, the chili doesn't bother the birds, but it does bother the mammals.
Yeah, it's such a good and simple, easy deterrent to keep them away. But you need to be aware, the rats and mice, they will make their homes in your compost heaps, in your sheds, and if your home's not protected, they will make their nests within inside your homes, and then you have more difficulty at getting them out. So with the rats and mice, if you don't mind them in your garden, be aware, a lot of the times neighbours will complain and they'll try to get the council to force you to put poison down. So at the end of the day, it's probably worth just making sure you clean up after your bird feeders, focus on the birds and keep the rats and mice away.
If you want to stop squirrels or cats getting to the bird feeders, you can put springs or baffles below or above. Above can stop larger birds taking birds off bird tables or cats leaping onto bird tables, and underneath can stop them from climbing up. And you should also be feeding birds at a specific time of day so that they know when the food's going to be there, and to lessen the chances of other, maybe less wanted animals from utilising that food source. And also a tray to collect the dropped food underneath the bird feeder. That means that you've then got a ground feeder just from the crumbs of the birds higher up, and it also means at the end of the day you can just throw away anything that hasn't been eaten.
It's really good advice just to catch all that wasted food and stop attracting the rats and mice and other animals that you maybe don't want.
So as Kevin said earlier, you don't want your ground feeders to be too near an area that an animal can sit, for example a cat, in weight. But it is good if you're using a hanging feeder to have it quite near a hedge, not near enough that an animal could leap from the hedge to the feeder, but near enough so that if something startles the bird, they can fly to safety quickly. And they can also stand there waiting for it to be safe to fly out and get food and leave again.
Our neighbour has several bird feeders up, and you see the birds, they come in to the bush and the trees to start with, and they hang about there just for a few seconds, making sure the feeder's safe, and then they hop down. And once they're finished feeding, they usually hop back into it as well.
Another thing about positioning your bird feeder is that not only do you want it to be somewhere where you can watch it from your house, which is likely the reason you have a bird feeder in the first place, but you want it to be somewhere that you can easily access if you want to clean the feeder or top up the food. Bird baths are just as important as feeders in a sense, because in summer, droughts can mean that animals can't find water as well as food, and in winter, water sources may be frozen over so that animals can't find water that way. In winter, if you're using a bird bath, try and remove any ice whenever you can during the day so the water is still able to be used by the birds or mammals. Crack and remove this ice if possible and fill the water back up. Try and keep water level to 2 inches or less, however, so that small birds can stand on the base of the bird bath when using it, and use a shallow dish so that the water can be reached for drinking without birds having to get in the water itself. If you already own a bird bath or a dish which is too deep, just add some flat stones or rocks at the bottom, which is a good idea to do with a bird bath if it has a slippery base anyway, as birds rather stand on an area where they can grip than an area which will make them slip. A bird bath doesn't need to be anything fancy, it can just be a bowl, whether on the ground or whether on some sort of stand. In summer as well, you may want to position your bird bath in a shaded area, as this will keep the water better for longer and allow birds to cool off when using the water itself. It's a good idea to have this a foot or so away from a bird feeder so that things don't fall from the feeder into the bird bath as well as the bird's droppings as well. And if you can, position a perch nearby to the bird bath but not over it so that birds can sit and preen on this and look out for danger after they've had their bath.
And lastly, this is such a great opportunity to do the BTO Garden Birdwatch Survey. It's a daily survey of the birds in your garden. You submit your results on the Garden Watch part of the BTO website because you're going to be seeing lots of birds, and that data is really important for population trends.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that it's given you even more to think about when it comes to feeding birds. While you can just put peanuts in a feeder and put it outside your window, there's so many other things you can do, and there's a lot to think about when it comes to the safety of the birds that you're feeding, particularly when it comes to trying to avoid predation of the birds and making sure that they stay healthy when using the feeder. After all, you want the experience of feeding birds to be beneficial to the natural world and not a hindrance to it. If you don't know whether it's safe or not to put a certain food out on your bird feeder, then have a look online and make sure you're looking at a reputable source. Tune in to our next podcast, which should be coming in the next few days, which is going to be about common misconceptions regarding wildlife, which a few people have nominated as an idea for us to cover.